Good morning, class. My name is Shane Murr. I'm a grad student in Health 502, and as a result, I prepared a presentation for you that introduces the journal article that I will be reviewing. It's a pretty brief and simple article, which I think will suit well for this short presentation and for this abbreviated class, so I'll dive right into it. The article title is Awareness and Knowledge of 2008 Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans, so this focuses on the two key concepts of awareness and knowledge that we'll define a little later, and of course the exercise or physical activity goals that were set forth in the most recent publications about a decade ago in 2008. Giving you a brief overview of this presentation before we dive into the key areas that will be assessed on our grading rubric. This survey that was administered is from a group called Health Styles. It's a secondary or second round, as you can see in the notes, type survey, meaning it's a follow-up to a larger survey that was administered before it. That large survey, called Consumer Styles surveys, are reported about 21,000 people in the year that this study was done. What it does is assess those two key terms, awareness and knowledge, which we'll talk more about. Ultimately, the survey responses yielded about 4,500, 4,600 respondents that could be assessed or graded, so to speak. There were very simple responses that they could give. Again, we'll talk more about that. The results were post-stratified and assessed for statistical significance. And finally, one of the key findings that you'll notice as we go throughout is that the awareness and knowledge levels amongst the respondents were quite low, something that I think you'll see for yourselves in a minute. Defining our research problem here, what you're looking at is some limited data on the understanding of physical activity targets set forth by these governing bodies. We know the behaviors, as we'll talk about, in terms of how engaged people or Americans are in physical activity, but we're not aware of how knowledgeable or understanding they are of those guidelines. As the second bullet point touches on, there are varying guidance coming out over the years on physical activity. What this means is they've been broadcasting different terminology, different concepts on physical activity, different recommendations, and that has turned out to be a point of confusion, as we'll touch on in the findings section at the end. Overall, those behaviors, engagement in physical activity is poor in Americans, and many might guess that. The CDC report I reference here cites only 20% of adults engaging in the recommended weekly amounts of physical activity, which looks at both aerobic and strength training guidelines. Physical activity does also decrease with age, so that's a key problem that is a reason we want to address awareness and knowledge here. This can start as early as the early teen years, is the research article that I dug into found. So we want to get that awareness and knowledge up at an early age and make an effort to encourage increased physical activity or sustained physical activity throughout the adult years. The research objective, so what are we looking to accomplish here? As we stated in the previous slide, despite many recommendations about physical activity broadcasted through different channels and over several decades' time, we believe that awareness and knowledge are relative unknowns, so we need to get a better understanding of what that looks like. The researchers' expectations for this were that the awareness and knowledge would be relatively low, and they based that assumption primarily off the low levels of adherence that we see to physical activity guidelines in current American adults. Again, driving this point home, we know what the physical activity behaviors look like. That's who is and who is not engaging in exercise, what the percentages look like there. But little is known about, again, these terms, awareness and knowledge, that we'll be talking about on the very next slide here. The researchers made initial estimates before completing their study. They overestimated significantly, as we find out. The methodology here, I mentioned at the very beginning, the overview, that this was a mailed survey by Health Styles. It gathers respondent feedback through simple sending of surveys and looking for responses back. This was the follow-up survey to the larger, more comprehensive Consumer Styles survey. Health Styles focusing on public health-related issues, and you can see a number of them on the slide. Physical activity being a key one, nutrition, media usage, things of that nature are being assessed through this follow-up survey. As was also pointed out, about 4,500 folks returned health styles surveys. There were several that excluded certain responses that were necessary demographic information responses to questions, and those had to be discarded, and that left about 4,300 acceptable surveys to be analyzed. Key to point out here, the surveys were administered over a relatively brief period of time, administered and I should say returned. It's about a 2-month window from August to September. Pretty tight window to get information out and expect responses back, so that may have limited their sample size here. And to incentivize this, because so many mailed surveys are simply discarded by folks when they're received, there was a small cash payment as well as an enrollment in a larger sweepstakes prize for those that did complete full and successful surveys. Just a tiny bit more detail here on the methodology. To assess awareness and knowledge, a simple question with multiple choice responses was given on each topic. Here verbatim are the two questions. The awareness question: have you seen, heard, or read anything about government physical activity guidelines within the last year? Respondents had the option of yes, no, or unsure. Knowledge was a little bit more robust. They were asked to identify the minimum amount of moderate intensity physical activity the government recommends for substantial health benefits. Now, 5 choices were given. It got a little bit complex here. Various ways that you can present those physical activity goals might read 150 minutes per week, which is in fact the most current and appropriate answer to give. There were other options like 3 sessions per week for 30 minutes, 2 sessions per week of 75 plus minutes. So there were many different choices as well as unsure available to select from. Demographic info was also collected. Pretty standard stuff here: sex, age, education and income levels, race or ethnicity. Marital status was a little bit of an interesting one. I wasn't necessarily expecting that. And also body mass index, so their weight management essentially. Statistical analysis used pairwise t-tests, as well as a concept I'm not terribly familiar with, but they're called orthogonal polynomial contrasts. Post-stratified data, that means that it was adjusted to match current U.S. Census metrics there, so that we have a fair representation of the United States population at large. Getting here into the findings and the results, the researchers did determine that there were statistically significant differences in the awareness and knowledge existing in the different demographic groups that were previously just discussed. When it comes to the sex, the first one on that top bullet point, the female population was proven to be a lot more aware of these guidelines than the male population. The most aware age group was those 25 to 44. The races and ethnicities with more awareness were all those aside from Hispanic and the other race or ethnicity selection boxes. And when it came to education, this is where knowledge found a statistically significant difference. Those with a higher education level showed a greater knowledge of those of physical activity guidelines. The one that did not show any difference was body mass index. There were no statistically significant findings there. The most staggering to me is the overall knowledge performance. It was quite low. It was only 0.56% of respondents that showed they were truly knowledgeable of those guidelines. Again, they did have more options to choose from there, 5 different multiple choice selections plus unsure, but a particularly low finding there, which is disappointing. Again, the more knowledgeable folks, those with college degrees, were scoring better than those without college degrees, but overall less than 1%. What you'll find is that the researchers touched on how many of the respondents selected a multiple choice option that reflected previous physical activity guidelines. And what that implies to me is that there is knowledge out there. It's just shifting in terms of the guidelines. The guidelines are shifting, and that's led to selections of outdated recommendations. Continuing with those findings and results in the discussion by the researchers, conclusions really is what we're looking at here. The lack of awareness and knowledge of physical activity certainly matched what was expected there with that lack of participation in physical activity. Because participation is low, it's reasonable to expect, and it was proven in this research study that awareness and knowledge were also quite low. Behavior change is really something that they want to drive home here. Behavior change is kind of what suffers when there's a lack of awareness and knowledge, so we can't really shift that behavior toward exercising more, getting the percentage of Americans that engage in recommended weekly exercise up until that awareness and knowledge grows. It has to be a chicken before the egg type scenario. Again, the study does confirm that many folks were choosing previous guidelines, outdated information there, and the recommendation by the researchers was giving consistent guidelines with non-confusing language, very straightforward language, and guidelines that were not shifting regularly, despite the fact that there are new findings in any field and new guidance that might come out on physical activity based on new research. There were several campaigns, as you can see with the bottom bullet points here, that were more successful because they gave guidance that was consistent over long periods of time. The first was called the VERB campaign, which promotes physical activity in preteens. They targeted that as ages 9 to about 13. And there were more substantial improvements and what they considered a successful campaign based on a consistent message broadcasted for several years. The second one that was appropriate, was a good example here, was the National Cholesterol Education Program, which worked for at least a decade, at least from 1983 to 1995, and saw a substantial uptick in the number of folks that had now completed at least one cholesterol screening, one blood lipid panel in their adult life. So the consistent guideline being a recommendation. Finally, you have the citation page here, the researchers from the article, the Awareness and Knowledge article I introduced, as well as 2 other resources that help support this presentation. So thank you for your time and attention, and that should about do it.